Welcome back, once again adventurers, to Let's Play Biohazard 2 Real Survival. In the last episode, Claire Redfield searched through the one of the rooms available for exploration in the precinct and came across one of the survivors of the ill-fated Raccoon Police Department. A man known as Marvin Branner, or Bernard as I originally called him in the previous episode, who gave Claire the card key that she needed to unlock the locked doors in the hallway, and then proceeded to promptly lock a third door himself. Nevertheless, with the way open, Claire was able to explore part of the west area of the Raccoon Police Department, but unfortunately came across something slightly more deadly than a zombie, which is the infamous liquor mutant, which is the iconic mid-boss enemy of sorts in Biohazard 2. This creature would actually, real talk, this creature would actually return in later Biohazard titles, but for Biohazard 2 the liquor was essentially the staple creature. Though I still maintain the fact that even though it has giant claws as we saw in the FMV, even though it has a lynx-like tongue which is can be quite devastating, they're still not as notorious as hunters, and I will not back down on this point. They may be deadly and terrifying, but they are in no way, shape or form capable of the shenanigans that hunters are notorious for. And if you'll all remember at the end of the episode, it ended on a somewhat humorous note, as I ended up being stuck on memory card 1 on the simulator. And if I tried to use memory card 1, then the emulator locks up, and there is absolutely nothing I can do but to restart the emulator. But memory card 2 is working fine, and as you can see, we're back on the save again. And unfortunately I used one save because I may have done a minor trick, which in the previous episode, which actually did not have any real overall effect on the Let's Play in question, but whether it did have an effect remains to be seen, and will be revealed in due course. Not that that matters, because I ended up getting injured anyway in a fight with the zombies in the western corridor, which basically meant that I had to use some more healing items in the form of green herbs anyway. So I wasn't trying to cheat, but that little piece of magic in the second episode will become apparent in the near future, not the immediate future. But which means I will save again, just to get myself up to date. So back into the world of survival horror I go. And as you saw in the original episode, I did save twice, and I won't be saving again on memory card 1, or trying to save on memory card 1. There, we're back to 2 saves, which means that there are now 2 ink ribbons in the other item box, but I'm not overly worried, considering the fact that, as I said at the end of the previous episode, I will be trying to avoid saving. Of course, that means if I have to re-record this episode, then I will still have 2 saves, because that's how memory cards work. But there is nothing more we can do in the dark room, and we don't have any film that we can develop in the dark room, so the time has come to depart the save room for the moment. We may be back there in the future. back out into the precinct we go. And if we look at this blue directory here, we notice something interesting. On the second floor there is the Chief's office, the S.T.A.R.S office, and the library. Now, those of you who were paying attention at the beginning of my Biohazard Let's Play will notice that the signature on both of the S.T.A.R.S cards of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine is that of Brian Irons, the Chief of Police, who also makes a brief appearance in the novelization Biohazard The Beginning. And he and Chris Redfield get along well as Gil Grissom and Conrad Eckley in the series Crime Scene Investigation. And if you're a fan of that series, then you should know exactly how that works out. And this sign shows us that the dark room is to our left. We already know. And we don't want to leave the door open and destroy the red light of the dark room. But before we go upstairs, there was one other room that I wanted to explore, and I really I regret running into those zombies when I did. That was entirely my fault. The lag can be blamed on the emulator, but my tactics were less than effective. In short, I could have done better, but I'm not going to dwell on the matter. And this door is locked with a diamond lock, so and we don't have a diamond key at this point, so we're going to have to go back for it. Or we're going to have to find it in the other rooms of the police station. But now we ascend to the second floor, and immediately the music changes into a far more ominous, but somewhat subdued tone. And fortunately for Claire, myself included, there are no zombies waiting for us at the top of the stairs. But there is a window over here that Claire clearly doesn't have any sort of interest. But this door is locked. The knob turns, but the door won't budge. It seems to be sealed off from the other side. Though if we have a closer examination at the bottom of the door, we notice that it's slightly broken. However, Claire doesn't seem to be able to crawl through it, and probably a good idea considering the fact that we don't know what's lurking on the other side of that corridor. Although zombies might crawl under that hole, which is a terrifying prospect. There is something over here. Something is written on the mounting. The god of sun and the god of moon. They gaze upon me as the only thing that can release, I assume it's supposed to say, this red soul. There is something that the statue is holding, which is glowing rather brightly, as you can see. But and there are two statues either side of it. But I'm actually going to leave this area and move on to the next corridor and hope there are no zombies in here. There doesn't appear to be any sounds of shuffling, so we can only assume that there aren't zombies. Of course, they do tend to stand still, and when that happens, they tend not to make any noise whatsoever, although that doesn't happen for long. And this door has a placard next to it, which clearly reads S.T.A.R.S office, the headquarters of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, as it says in small font under the S.T.A.R.S acronym, which is the paramilitary unit that Jill and Chris belong to. But we're actually going to explore around this corner here, and looking around behind, there is a pair of handcuffs that are attached to a balcony there, although no one's attached to the end of them, which is Kind of interesting. And this door is locked, also by a spade lock. I'll need that spade key at some point. But there is something over here. A small ventilation shaft which is far too small for an adult to fit into. So clearly Claire can't go through that shaft, but heaven forbid a child actually end up being caught up in this whole entire situation. But can't go anywhere else, so let us explore the S.T.A.R.S office. And there is no one to be found. And this music is actually rather fitting in a somewhat macabre way. I believe the title of this theme is Nothing More to Do Here, which is a very fitting title because it really drives the fact home that for better or worse, Chris Redfield is not here, either in the police station or in the vicinity of Raccoon in any way, shape or form. The office, much like everywhere else that we've seen in the precinct, appears to be in a form of rather orderly disarray of sorts. There are quite a few offices around here. It's a picture of a young man. There's a good chance that it's her boyfriend. Well, there appears to be a blue beret on this desk, which can only mean that this is the workplace of none other than Jill Valentine herself. The desk is disorganized and untidy. It probably reflects its owner's personality. That is a very interesting assessment of your brother there, Claire. And speaking of which, there is actually a jacket. A brown leather jacket with the words Made in Heaven and a motif on the back. This is, I believe, the alternative costume that can be worn by Chris in the changing room in the mansion in the original Biohazard. And to continue this motif, the same imprint can be actually seen on the back of Claire's vest. Like brother, like sister. And talking of Chris, there is actually a very important file here. Daily Report, Chris Redfield, or Chris's Diary. August 8th. I talked to the chief today once again, but he refused to listen to me. I know for certain that Umbrella conducted T-virus research in that mansion. Anyone infected turns into a zombie. Well, considering how well Brian Irons gets on with Chris Redfield, it stands to reason that they wouldn't listen to each other. But the entire mansion went up in that explosion, along with any incriminating evidence. Since Umbrella employs so many people in town, no one is willing to talk about the incident. It looks like I'm running out of options. That statement about incriminating evidence isn't entirely true, because, believe it or not, the S.T.A.R.S weren't that incompetent to leave the all-important evidence files involving Umbrella's experiments, such as, the biological weapons report that was found in the Arclay laboratory, with slides with all the creatures, well, most of the creatures, that is to say the MA-39 Cerberus, the MA-121 Hunter, the FI-3 Shark Neptune, and most importantly the T-002 Tyrant and a photo of the research and development staff, which clearly incriminates, or clearly shows that Albert Wesker, who was the captain of the S.T.A.R.S, I might add, was also a not quite as former an Umbrella researcher as he was, even though he ultimately betrayed their plans for his own ambitions. Although, of course, he met a rather interesting, grueling fate, and depending on how you play, in Chris's scenario, he gets mauled by the Tyrant. In Jill's scenario, in the original Biohazard, he dies a miserable death at the hands of the Chimera in the power room. In either case, Wesker dies a truly miserable death in the original Biohazard. There's more reading to be done. August 17th. We've been receiving a lot of local reports about strange monsters appearing at random throughout the city. This must be the work of Umbrella. Well, it seems that the situation has been occurring much earlier than we thought, and that the destruction of the Arklay Mansion and the laboratory complex in question only bought Raccoon City and its citizens a brief period of time. The cliché calm before the storm, a very appropriate cliché at that. August 24th. With the help of Jill and Barry, I finally obtained information vital to this case. Umbrella has begun research on the new G virus, a variation of the original T virus. Haven't they done enough damage already? Now that information is dire indeed, because we don't just have the T virus to worry about anymore. Yeah. Now, for anyone playing Biohazard 2 the first time, they could very well be forgiven for thinking that the new liquor creatures are a byproduct of this new G-Virus. Minor spoiler warning, they're not. They're actually creatures created from the T-Virus, not the G-Virus. But, yeah, heaven forbid we actually have to go up against any sort of bioweapons that are created as a result of the G-Virus. But just goes to show that Umbrella's experiments, as the narrator put it so very appropriately, are indeed far from finished. As if the T-Virus wasn't already a threat. We talked it over and have decided to fly to the main Umbrella headquarters in Europe. I won't tell my sister about this trip because doing so could put her in danger. Please forgive me, Claire. Well, as honorable as your reasons were, Chris, if you had hoped that by not telling Claire that she wouldn't be roped up in this situation, I hate to break it to you, but your overall intentions have somewhat backfired. Because Claire Redfield is now in the heart of Raccoon City, the city that you and Jill fought valiantly to save during the events of the mansion incident. But, well, this diary is the second piece of evidence that corroborates Marvin's story. In other words, Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry, and possibly Chicken Heart Brad Vickers, if his cowardice doesn't get the better of him, did actually decide to take on Umbrella at its source by going to the Umbrella headquarters, no less, which is definitely putting them in harm's way. And this is truly hilarious localization. The Chris's diary has been filed with Chris in all capital letters. There is something that was hidden beneath the book of all things? Well, we take the unicorn medal. That we sell. The unicorn medal is entirely important, and if we examine it, we shall see why. Something is engraved on the back. Please guide me to the beautiful maiden who turned into stone as she waited for me. In other words, the stone maiden and the foyer of the police station. And there is nothing else on Chris's desk. Desk, because he doesn't have two. Nothing else on Chris's desk other than the reflection of his disorganized personality. What else could there be in the S.T.A.R.S office? There are various devices. This must be where they gathered information. Indeed, the apparatus that Claire is looking at right now just so happens to be the information equipment used by both Brad Vickers and Richard Eichen for use in investigations and cases. There is a storage lock over here which contains something truly useful that will ultimately help us in the long run. The grenade launcher. I know it's called the G launcher, but this does not launch G virus. That would be terrible otherwise, if that were the case. But it's an M79 grenade launcher. This thing actually, in a later game series known as Siphon Filter, is devastating indeed. Various rounds can be used. The cut stock causes a greater recoil. Made in the USA. Now, in the original Biohazard, the late Forrest Spire had a weapon which was essentially the grenade launcher, even though it was called the bazooka, although I called it the grenade launcher as such because it's exactly what it's called in later Biohazard titles. Well, the grenade launcher in the original Biohazard was devastating. It did have a tendency of overshooting enemies. You had to be incredibly precise with it. Whereas the M79 grenade launcher in Biohazard 2 is far more sophisticated and far more useful in dealing with enemies. Not quite as finicky as the one in Biohazard. There are unopened cardboard boxes. It looks like a rookie's desk. Indeed, this is the desk of Rebecca Chambers, and there is a bag with a first aid symbol on it, but there isn't anything inside. Several files from past cases. Nothing useful here. Not even from the Arkley murders, although that would actually be not be that unsurprising if that were the case. There is a desk over here that which I'll examine closely. There appears to be a replica of a gun on the desk. The owner is probably a member of the NRA, the American National Rifle Association, which can only mean this desk can belong to one person and one person alone. Barry Burton, master of the Magnum, and of cheesy dialogue. It was most certainly taken his family to safety after the events of the Mansion incident, and the possibility of retaliation against the S.T.A.R.S by Umbrella. And this desk is just so happens to be the desk of the infamous Captain Albert Wesker, head of the the Alpha Team and the S.T.A.R.S unit in general. It's trashed. Someone must have searched the desk. Well, case in point, if we search the desk about 50 times, there is actually something hidden here. And lo and behold, I'm actually going to show you what it is. So you can pause the game and or take a break now as I do this, because doing this 50 times is certainly going to be a stretch for anyone to sit through. But something I will say is that this music actually takes me back. It actually takes me back 20 years, back to the real life 1998, because I actually do have a real life story to tell you. Back in primary school, when Biohazard 2 was being advertised in PC and PlayStation magazines all throughout the country and indeed the world, there were stories by other primary school kids about Biohazard 2, and back in the early days of the internet, the very rudimentary days, and there is the film in question. I've taken the film. But while we wait on the screen here for the moment as I continue my story, there were little bits of information in gaming magazines that were sort of being talked about by other kids in primary school that I was in, and I would actually go to the library. This wasn't allowed at the time, and is really not really permitted anywhere. For library use is meant to be for education, school education only. But I actually used the internet to try and find out more about Biohazard 2. But there's a little bit of a twist to the story, because while the other kids were more interested in the video game aspects of it, I myself was somewhat morbidly curious more about the actual events of Biohazard 2. And believe it or not, at one point a teacher actually threatened to bar me from using the internet for research, for researching video games and for researching something that didn't pertain to school education. Well, I can certainly not blame them for the latter, but if they had decided to do so for the former, I would actually have argued on this point. Of course, it goes without saying that later on, that morbid curiosity of my 8-year-old self would eventually cause me more trouble than it's worth. And this is the, again, well, as much as people gripe on the live-action films, and I have done on numerous occasions, especially with the later films, my gripe with the filmmakers is their blasé video game look on Biohazard and Biohazard 2 itself, whereas I was more interested in the actual inverse universe of Biohazard and Biohazard 2. And this music always reminds me of my 8-year-old self, because I remember reading a bit of an excerpt about Biohazard 2 in one of the magazines, and it said something along the lines about Claire and Leon arriving in Raccoon City, and I always wondered what was the explanation behind the events of Raccoon City, behind the events of Biohazard 2, and I always wondered what had happened to the S.T.A.R.S members, the original survivors of the first Biohazard, or Resident Evil as I knew of it as at the time. Never did I realize that I was already aware of the original Biohazard, having seen my cousins play it 2 years prior, as I believe I've recounted that particular story in the original Biohazard Real Survival Let's Play. But that is a bit of real-life trivia about me that I have rarely mentioned to anyone, so now you know. And what a bit of real-life trivia it's been, because Biohazard, and in particular Biohazard 2 and its follow-up, which I will not mention here, Biohazard has been a part of my life for 20 years now. And that's all I'm going to say on that particular matter. I was a child back then, interested in things that he shouldn't be interested in. And there is actually something over here, behind the desk of Wesker. There are various trophies here in a glass cabinet. One of them reads, Marksman Contest winner Chris Redfield, for obvious reasons. And I believe second place probably would have been taken by Forrest Spire, which is something I probably pointed out in the original Biohazard Let's Play as well. There was also a television above the cabinet there, which probably showed news footage, and was probably how the S.T.A.R.S kept up to date on media information. And there is a picture of the S.T.A.R.S members themselves on the wall here, standing in front of the police helicopter in question. Now the two figures on the far left and lower left are actually not characters in question. People might have originally thought that they were Edward Dewey, who was briefly mentioned in the original Biohazard adventure, as well as an unknown person, but these two characters actually never make another appearance. But I will tell you who the others are, because I have them memorized, from the back row to the front row. From left to right is Forrest Spire, holding his own personalized grenade launcher. I don't know what model it is, but I'm sure someone can look up on the wiki to find out. Next to him is the ill-fated Kenneth J. Sullivan, the Bravo Team Field Scout and chemist expert, who unfortunately met his end at the jaws of the zombie that was encountered originally in Biohazard and referenced in the intro of Biohazard 2. The oldest S.T.A.R.S member, and just as built as Barry, and yet even he was overpowered by a lone zombie, which just shows you how actually terrifying zombies actually are in the world of Biohazard. Next to Kenneth is the Bravo team, and if in general the communications agent for the entirety of S.T.A.R.S, Richard Eichen, who unfortunately was poisoned and died of his wounds thanks to Yawn, the giant snake. He was very close with Rebecca Chambers, who I will say was not, I can tell you is not in this photo, which means that this was taken prior to her joining S.T.A.R.S, because she did join S.T.A.R.S in June. And of course next to him is the captain of S.T.A.R.S and the Alpha team, Mr. Shades, known as Albert Wesker, wearing his iconic pilot shades that he pretty much wore for most of his life, especially even during his days at the Arclay Laboratory. But here he is in his capacity as a S.T.A.R.S officer, even though he's still attached to Umbrella at this point. And next to him is, of course, Barry Burton, the man of the hour, the man with the Silver Serpent Magnum, which is even more powerful than the Colt Python. And at the end of the row, standing there rather awkwardly in his trademark yellow jacket, is Chicken Heart himself, Mr. Brad Vickers, 35 years old, a relatively competent hacker and helicopter pilot on par with Chris Redfield, but anyone would be afraid of dying, but Brad Vickers suffered this in spades. His condition was such that you wondered why he was attached to units such as S.T.A.R.S or any military unit, combat unit for that matter. Because if you'll remember, he abandoned the S.T.A.R.S team when they were attacked by the Cerberus BOWs, the zombie dogs, when the mansion incident went down. But he did redeem himself at the end by returning with a helicopter, taking the surviving S.T.A.R.S members back to safety and civilization, and also giving the S.T.A.R.S the weapon that they needed to destroy the T-002 Tyrant bioorganic weapon to begin with, the all-important rocket launcher, without which the S.T.A.R.S could not hope to have survived. But now for the remaining 4 S.T.A.R.S members, Sub-Captain Enrico Marini, the second of command, the captain in charge of the Bravo team and Wesker's right hand, although he was fairly certain that that role might be usurped by either Chris or Barry. And he actually didn't actually have too great of an opinion of Chris, and even in his final moments in the mansion incident actually suspected Chris of being the traitor, never suspecting that his superior officer would be the one to ultimately murder him. And speaking of our 2 iconic heroes, there in the center there are Chris Redfield, and beside him Jill Valentine, decked out in all their S.T.A.R.S combat outfits. As Claire will be staring at this with melancholy and nostalgia. And finally, rounding out the team is the late Joseph Frost, who was booted up from the Bravo team to the Alpha team. There he is with his iconic shotgun, which unfortunately did not serve him well, as he was unfortunately torn to shreds by the Cerberus in question, making him the first casualty of the Alpha team. But the rest of the S.T.A.R.S members are all decked out in wearing, or rather carrying, MP5s, which none of them ever used in the events of the mansion incident. Probably they were all stored on the helicopters, but the Bravo's helicopter was pretty much a derelict, and Brad pretty much absconded with the rest of them when he made his own escape. Of course, we go behind here, and we see the logo of the S.T.A.R.S office and the S.T.A.R.S organization in general, which were formed 2 years ago in 1996 as a counter-terrorism unit, as the original Biohazard instruction manual would actually tell you. But there you can see clearly, if Claire just moves off to the side, there you can see clearly that it definitely reads Special Tactics and Rescue Service, not Squad. Yes, I'm one of those people that will rant on that for all time, but there is something hidden behind Wesker's desk. Some more handgun bullets. I guess we should thank Albert for something. And there isn't anything useful on this shelf. So, without further ado, there is really not much else to explore here. But there is one more thing, which is very indicative of the 90s. If Claire can actually, if I can just get close enough to examine it. I might have to examine it from the other side. But there is a telephone there, but more importantly, nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary, but more importantly, this is actually a, well, Claire won't tell you, so I will. This is actually a fax machine, believe it or not. Remember what I said about the 90s? Well, fax machines were definitely a part of that decade back then. Nobody uses fax machines anymore with the power of the internet and email. But fax machines are definitely a sign that you are in the 90s. So there literally is nothing more to do at this point. So we shall depart downstairs and put this medallion to good use. And lo and behold, just as Claire is about to leave the S.T.A.R.S office for good, the fax machine in question suddenly decides at this moment to actually print out a fax of sorts. Federal Police Department Internal Investigation Report. Now, the file clearly shows 3 pages, even though there were only 2 pages that were printed. I guess that one kind of slipped under the radar there. And it's addressed to Mr. Chris Redfield of the Raccoon City Police Department S.T.A.R.S Division. As per your request, we have conducted our internal investigation and discovered the following information. Seems like Chris has some outside contacts of his own that he's been using to do some digging. He's a very cautious and very intelligent man, is Chris Redfield. 1. Regarding the G-Virus currently under development by Umbrella Incorporated. So far it is unconfirmed that the G-Virus even exists. We are continuing with our investigation. Well, given the fact that Umbrella would want to keep things under wraps after the debacle of the Mansion incident and the Arklay murders, that's not really surprising. Although, of course, since we know for certain that the T-Virus exists, we can take it as read that the G-Virus is almost certainly being developed by Umbrella. Unfortunately, for legal proceedings and due process, if there is no evidence of the G-Virus, then it will be extremely difficult to prosecute the Umbrella Corporation over this particular matter. Even though they could pretty much be shot to the wall with the evidence of the Mansion and the T-Virus experiments. 2. Regarding Mr. Brian Irons, Chief of the Raccoon City Police Department. Mr. Irons has allegedly received a large sum of funds and bribes from Umbrella Incorporated over the last 5 years. He was apparently involved in the cover-up of the Mansion Lab case, along with several other incidents in which Umbrella appears to have direct involvement. Mr. Irons had been arrested under suspicion of rape on 2 separate counts during his years as a university student. He underwent psychiatric evaluation as a result of the charges, but was released due to circumstantial evidence as well as his phenomenal academic standing. As such, extreme caution is advised when dealing with them. Signed, Jack Hamilton, Section Chief, Internal Investigations of the United States Federal Police Department. Well, that is truly disturbing indeed. The mail to Chris has been filed. Well, that's certainly ominous bad news on our part. Yeah, for those of you who weren't already aware of this at the time of Biohazard 2, Brian Irons is an incredibly shady fellow, and that's an understatement. That is, to call him shady is actually an incredible understatement. And from the moment they knew each other, Chris knew that he didn't like Irons for any particular reason, but even he could never have suspected that Irons would sink so low and as to be so sleazy as to be tied in with the Umbrella Corporation. But having said that, this certainly explains why Irons refused to listen to Chris in the first place. And having said that, it was probably a bad move on the part of Chris and the other stars to actually bring the information about Umbrella and the Mansion incident to Irons' desk to begin with. Given that this file clearly shows that he has been firmly in Umbrella's pocket, and indeed is the one responsible for making sure that the stars were not believed by anyone when they tried to break news of Umbrella's activities to the media and the public. which is very unfortunate indeed. And we may actually end up having to cross paths with Mr. Chief Brian Irons eventually at some point, and we will need to be ready for him when that time comes. But just goes to show that Chris does have someone on the outside who is not on Umbrella's payroll, who is actually investigating some dirt on them, and has made some success, which will be pretty beneficial. But I believe I believe this is a good time to end this particular episode of Let's Play Biohazard 2 Real Survival. Once again, I know that this episode is less than an hour long, but it's close. It's definitely close, but I like to break up these episodes in the fashion that I do to try and keep to the format that I'm comfortable with recording in. And if you like the format thus far, then thank you very much. And I hope you continue watching future episodes as they are made available on my channel, in my almighty citadel. But in the next episode, Claire will depart the S.T.A.R.S office and make her way back down to the front entrance and the main hall of the police station. And this time she has something in her arsenal that she can actually use to deal with the liquor. It is still in that corridor. As always, adventurers, until next we meet.